Download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources at savantwealth.com/guides.
Thank you for joining us. Our topic today is planning for a lasting retirement. My name is Chris Ruedi, and I'm a certified financial planner professional and CFA charter holder. My family and I live in Champaign, Illinois, and as an advisor, I work with clients throughout our central Illinois region and beyond. I'm pleased to co-host today's webinar with my colleague, Joe Marmorato. Joe joins us from our financial planning team and is based in our Lancaster, Pennsylvania office. Joe, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Chris. I'm glad to be here. Like Chris mentioned, I'm part of Savant Planning Team in our private client group, and I'm really excited to dive in and talk about what we can do to plan now for a long, lasting retirement.
Very good. And as we get started today, need to point out that, while Joe and I think we have a lot of good information that hopefully you all take away, we do intend this for general information purposes. It's not intended to be a substitute for the one-on-one conversations that you have with your Savant advisor or any other professional that you might work with. And of course, a copy of our current written disclosures will appear again at the end of our presentation and are available at savantwealth.com. So again, welcome everyone. Hope your day is off to a good start and you've had a good start to your week. Appreciate you being here on what Joe and I feel like is a very important topic, and one that with our backgrounds, we specialize and have a lot of conversations in planning for a lasting retirement. And as you can see up here on the screen, we've got several things to talk about, really, kind of running the gamut on what we think is, important to consider when you're considering retirement and making sure that it's a lasting one. Each one of these topics could be its own standalone webinar. And the good news is my colleagues here at Savant have and will continue to present on each one of these areas. So stay tuned for those in the future. But, our goal today is really to offer some insights, no matter where you may be on the retirement spectrum, whether that's you're just starting to think about retirement, maybe planning to retire soon, or if you're already retired but not feeling as confident as you'd like to be. So we won't have time to address all the questions that you might have today, but later on you will see in the chat box of our Zoom screen a link to set up a complimentary 15-minute call where we can address some of those more unique or specific questions on the information that we present today, should you have them. So our first topic, determining retirement needs. I don't know if any of you are travelers out there, maybe have physical fitness goals, been handed projects to complete at work. It really all comes down to you can't know if you're on track for success, whether that's in a personal goal, a work-related goal, retirement-related goal, until we set some determination of where we're trying to go. What is our end target here? And so for determining retirement needs, the first place I'd like to start is, setting a goal for consumption. And we use the term consumption because it's not just what we need to pay the bills every month, our utilities, grocery bill, mortgage, things like that. But in retirement, we've got wants. We've got the things that we want to do with our lifestyle when we stop working, and wishes, those lifelong goals that you might have had, that anniversary trip, the family travel. Maybe you'd like to benefit a foundation. So when we think about consumption, we want to include needs, wants, and wishes. And so the best way that I know to do that, or in the conversations that I have on talking about consumption, is what would you like to use on a monthly basis? A lot of times we can talk about things on an annual basis, but we pay our bills monthly. So we talk about consumption in a monthly amount. And particularly that is an after-tax monthly amount. So based on what we take home after we pay Uncle Sam and the government, any tax-related items, what do we actually spend? And so initially to do that, we talk about, will your current assets, their investment accounts that you've accumulated, your other physical assets, the incomes that you'll have in retirement, will that support a given level of consumption, not only now, but in the future? One of the things that, I think has been painfully obvious to many Americans coming out of the pandemic is that the impact of rising costs, inflation. We've really felt the sting of that over the last number of years. And while we're very happy to see that the rate of those price increases is starting to come down, it's a good reminder that as we enter into retirement, we're probably going to need to plan for not only what we want to spend in today's dollars, but what it will take in future years to provide the same level of benefit. We're living longer as a society with technology, modern medicine. We're finding that we're living longer, so we need to plan for longer periods of retirement. And you couple that with, some of the things that we've seen are a shift in mentality where folks maybe want to retire a little sooner than they had maybe pre-pandemic because we're putting a different emphasis on that work-life balance. So when you combine the impact of living longer with maybe starting retirement a little bit earlier than we have previously, you need to make sure that your plans will last and for a long period of time and to maybe a greater age. The best way we know how to do this is, a lot of people are good at budgeting maybe on a monthly basis or even a year or two out. But when you start to think several years in advance, I find it very difficult to do that on the back of an envelope. So at Savant, what we do is try to use like a financial planning program that helps us project out those costs and do that analysis to make sure that not only in the early parts of retirement, but in those extended and latter stages of retirement, we're still in a good consumption. We're still being able to maintain that lifestyle. Simply put, what we're trying to do is come up with a plan that we don't run out of money before we run out of life. One of the areas I would like to point out, and it certainly becomes one of the larger areas of concern, especially as we think about people retiring sooner, is what are we going to use as a replacement for possibly the healthcare that we receive from the employment that we have currently. So what options are out there? More importantly, what cost does that add into this initial consumption target? And Joe, I know this is something that you focus on in drafting financial plans. Maybe take a minute and talk about some of the different options possibly that are out there beyond the employer-sponsored coverage that most folks have while they're working.
Sure thing. So yes, as you said, healthcare is one of the largest expenses that you're going to be facing in retirement. Actually, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, one of their reports here showed that healthcare costs for those ages 55 to 64 is approximately $5,800, and even more so for those individuals over age 65. So there's various options for health coverage once you cease employment. Of course, you should be able to claim Medicare upon reaching age 65. However, if you're retiring prior to that, you can look into the Affordable Care Act. Especially with the Affordable Care Act, they have the pre-existing conditions exemption there. So that could be favorable to you if needed. You also, a lot of employers, if they have over 20 employees, should offer COBRA. And that basically extends the group health coverage to you for a certain duration. Typically, it's 18 months after termination, although there are some circumstances that you can actually get coverage for up to 36 months afterwards. So as Chris said, healthcare is a very large expense here. There are plenty of options out there, and you really just need to look and analyze what is going to be most appropriate for you at that point in time.
Very good. Thank you, Joe. And, chart up here on the screen, we'll come back to this in another section, but I referenced, using that planning software and what, have found in conversations over the years is that, visuals seem to help. So hopefully this resonates with some of you out there, but really to call out in this graph down there in the bottom left-hand side, that probability of success. The goal, the output of using a financial planning program, as opposed to just trying to estimate some of this either on the back of an envelope or mentally, is that, we can really see as we input different scenarios, what is that outcome of not only lasting now, but long-term, taking into an account the rising cost of inflation, putting a cost of living adjustment inflated over a, multi-decade period. So, something where you can call back on and review over time in subsequent meetings to make sure, hey, are we still on track? So more on this later, but just wanted to put that out there to show an example of what's available. So once you figure out what we're trying to consume in retirement, once we find that initial target amount of consumption, a lot of people say, Chris, that's great. I'm glad we've settled on that, but I'm not getting a paycheck anymore. Where is my income going to come from? Specifically, help me, outline where we get that from to build that comfort level so I can feel comfortable to walk away from work and know I don't have that regular earned paycheck coming in, but possibly we can create an income stream that can help me solve that consumption goal. And to do that, I like to kind of break it down into a couple different parts. The first is to start with what I refer to as non-market dependent sources. And simply put, those are things that don't fluctuate, aren't dependent on what markets do over a 1 quarter, 1 year, multi-year period of time, but things that come in either in a guaranteed nature or at least a little more fixed and non-market dependent. So those would be things like Social Security, pension, annuities if you have them, or possibly some rental or farming income. From there, you can start to think about required minimum distributions. And this is something that I'll let Joe speak to in a little bit, but at a certain age, certain types of retirement plans begin to force us to take a withdrawal. And so once you hit that age and you do have those forced withdrawals come into play, you can start to think of that as another layer on top of these, quote, non-market dependent sources. And then the last area is everything else. So that would be things like your IRAs, 401ks, Roth IRAs, non-retirement accounts, so sometimes referred to as brokerage or possibly a trust account, and then bank savings, accumulated bank cash. All of those things are what I refer to as supplementary or market dependent. They fluctuate on a daily basis. They're up and down from year to year. And those are the things that we draw on in addition to what is kind of that fixed source, those floor on getting to that initial target amount. And so Joe might invite you to step in here and make a comment on required minimum distributions, because there's been a lot of changes over the last few years on when those come into play and at what age.
There definitely have been a lot of changes over the past couple of years. So required minimum distributions, many of you may have an employer tax deferred account, such as a 401k, or you have a 403b or traditional IRA. Many of those retirement accounts that you contribute to and receive a tax deduction for are going to be taxable when you distribute those funds. Now, Congress and the government have decided and determined that these retirement accounts are meant for retirement. They're not meant to be passed down to younger generations. So they want to force distributions from these accounts during your retirement years, just as Chris had said. Now, in the past, the RMD age, I'm going to refer to required minimum distributions as RMDs, that used to be 70 and a half. And around 2020, Congress increased it to 72. Just recently, they passed another bill that actually raises that to 73. So for those individuals who were born in 1951 to 1959, your required minimum distribution age is 73. If you were born in 1960 or later, they also passed a provision here that would increase that age to 75. So you need to be aware of when you are actually going to be subject to these required minimum distributions, depending on the type of retirement account that you have. And I'll get more into that later on in the presentation as well.
Thank you. So with a lot of the focus that I have in conversations is around these supplemental sources, around these variable accounts, that things that go up and down, and the things that really need to be planned for and factored in when we're looking to solve that consumption goal. So I'll just throw out the example of a 2-person household that wants to consume $10,000 of after-tax monthly spending from all sources. So the first thing that we do is we look and say, okay, how much is coming in from that top box that we referenced in the previous slide? Those, fixed guaranteed things like Social Security, pension. And let's just say, for example, that in this, the combined Social Security and small pension amount for a 2-person household amounts to $6,000. That leaves $4,000 to be funded by, what I'm calling these supplemental or market dependent sources. It's important that a individual or family understand the breakdown of how much is market dependent and how much is non-market dependent. If you have a strong Social Security benefit, if you're lucky enough to have a pension of some kind, that takes a lot of the variability out of your plan, depending on the amount of consumption that we're trying to have. But in this case, if we're trying to solve for $4,000 a month from non-guaranteed sources, things that are variable, that amounts to about $48,000 a year annually. And so what we're trying to essentially hone in on is, depending on what age that you retire, what amount can I reasonably withdraw from this variable portion of my investment portfolio and sustainably do that for a number of years. Doesn't matter if the market goes up or down, because in the short term, we know things can be quite volatile. Looking at what rate does that equate to? Sometimes we think about it as a range of 3 to 5% annually from these supplemental sources. So again, you can kind of look and see, hey, if we're trying to solve for 48,000 of supplemental withdrawals, and you divide that by 3 or 5%, kind of gives you an idea of maybe the size of portfolio that you would need to have to be able to reasonably sustain that for an extended period of time. You also want to consider your risk tolerance, your investment allocation, that mix of stocks and bonds, and if you have any desired legacy wishes. And legacy, we mean gifts to heirs, next generation, possibly charitably. And if you want to leave a desired amount at an advanced age or at death, you need to factor that into your withdrawal projections. So again, the goal is to identify an amount that can be withdrawn annually without substantially depleting that investment resource, especially in those early years, because that's where we find are the areas of critical variability. If we draw too much too soon in retirement, it may not leave enough in our investment portfolio to get the growth that we need to fund those later years of retirement. So again, back to that chart I referenced earlier, this, I think, hopefully can be helpful. This is our example, 2-person household. And, the various bar charts there show they maybe have several years before their planned retirement. But where it gets into the yellow chart, that's where it shows, hey, now we don't have the income coming in from our jobs. We need to solve for that $10,000 a month goal. Maybe in that first year, we're not Social Security eligible, or we're deferring Social Security to try to build up a bigger benefit. So maybe in that first year, we have withdrawals only, and no non-market dependent sources, no fixed income coming in. But then as time goes on, you start to see we can introduce some of those other colored bars. We introduce Social Security, maybe a little bit of pension, and the amount of the withdrawals as a percentage of our overall consumption starts to decrease. And we see that as a good thing. Joe talked about required minimum distributions, where it switches to orange in the graph here. That's just a visual depiction of when it switches from an elective withdrawal in yellow to maybe something that's more mandatory in the form of a required minimum distribution. So then the third piece, which I think is, incredibly critical for anyone planning for retirement, and especially, wanting to make sure you have that peace of mind in retirement, is establishing and then utilizing a contingency fund. You might call it an emergency fund, a cash reserve, but really what we're talking about is setting up and setting aside a portion of funds that can somewhat insulate us against a short-term up and down of the market, of which we have no control over, and of which we know we need to accept to try to get the longer-term growth over time that we would expect from a portfolio invested for growth. So in the previous example, we looked at determining that annual amount of supplemental income. We said, for our example, $4,000, $48,000 annually. So in terms of contingency funds, what we're thinking of is, if we can, up into retirement, set aside maybe somewhere between 50 and 100,000 in cash type of accounts. And by that, I mean bank savings, money market, possibly things like short-term CDs, anything that's of minimal risk, liquid, and accessible easily. creates an option for us that when we have periods of market decline, which, if we're going to be in retirement for 2, possibly 3 decades, we need to understand there's going to be bear markets. There's going to be times where volatility works against us and our portfolios are down temporarily. If we can have a sizable amount of cash set aside to use in lieu of maybe some of those planned withdrawals to solve, again, in our example, for that $4,000 a month of monthly consumption, if we can go to cash and use that instead of drawing from investments when they're temporarily down, it can act as a buffer. It can act as a little bit of an insurance policy against some of those short-term downturns. And it really hopefully provides peace of mind for retirees to know, hey, I can comfortably step out of the office, turn off the lights for the last time, and have a plan of where I'm going to get cash for, 12 to 15, maybe 18 months on the long end, without having to worry about, am I selling at a relative low point? Am I drawing too much out of my portfolio to fund the money that I need, no matter whether the market's up or down, as I move forward into retirement? Then, when we have a year like we did in 2023, or we have in the past, post-pandemic, where we have large returns, maybe over and above what's planned for, then you can always take more profit in those years, replenish any of the cash you may have used in the contingency fund, and now you're ready to go again to repeat the same process if necessary at a future down point. So I mentioned market declines. There's been several notable market declines in the 80 years following World War II. And each one of these instances is unique and different. Some are longer, some are shorter. We've got a few listed there. But on average, we feel like they last about a year in length, with the eventual recovery to previous high values being closer to 1.5 or 2 years. And so that's where we get the amount of, if we can build up our contingency fund, if we can have that 50 to 100,000 in this example, but 1 to 2 years of planned withdrawals, that should get us through most of the historical downturns that we've seen. Doesn't guarantee that we wouldn't have a longer one in the future, but I think if you can plan for what we've seen, you're likely going to be in a good position. And again, it's going to provide that immense peace of mind. Some people say, hey, that's a lot. Where am I going to build up a contingency fund? We don't have that kind of cash to set aside. It doesn't have to be all accumulated at once. And if you're starting to plan for retirement, maybe a few years in advance, building this up over time is something that is perfectly acceptable. And you can even continue building it into the early years of retirement. So something that we found to be quite effective and hopefully adds to the ability to make that retirement a lasting one. Joe, with that, I'll let you take the reins here a little bit and talk a little bit about tax, because I know that's an important piece of retirement planning and making sure we make those considerations as time goes on.
It definitely is an important piece. And thank you, Chris. So we are going to jump in here to some tax reduction strategies to consider during your retirement years and leading up to. So as the title of the slide says, smooth income tax rates over time, right? So retirement is anticipated to be a long duration in your life. And over the years, you've likely built up your retirement plans, whether they be through an employer, if you're individually funding a traditional IRA. There's many different types of retirement accounts out there. So it's really critical to understand exactly the type of account that you have and how it works. So as we had talked about before, some of these accounts, these tax-deferred accounts, they are subject to those RMD requirements, right? And as I mentioned, Congress has been pushing that date back for many individuals. So just to refresh again, if you're born between 1951 and 1959, your RMD age is 73. You can see that on the green circle there. If you're born in 1960 or later, then your RMD age is going to be 75. So just keep that change in mind in future years here. So is this delay in requiring RMDs actually a good thing or not? So when you take a required minimum distribution from these tax deferred accounts, because you received a tax benefit way back when you funded it, any withdrawal is going to be considered ordinary taxable income. So that can definitely increase your tax brackets over time here. So the longer that you delay and keep all of these RMDs growing tax deferred, you're likely going to have a larger RMD if you wait until you're required to take those funds out, because you've allowed them to grow for a longer period of time and they're being taken out over a shorter period of time now. So there are some strategies here to mitigate those RMDs if they are going to be substantial. And one different type of retirement account here that I'm going to talk about is a Roth IRA. Now, there are also different Roth accounts. You may have heard of a Roth 401k and so on. But a Roth IRA works quite differently than a traditional IRA in the sense that you don't receive an immediate tax benefit when you contribute to the fund. However, all of the earnings and growth are tax-free. Now, that's different than tax deferred, because tax-free, meaning you can take that out at a later date, completely tax-free. It won't impact your income tax return there. Now, there are some minor holding requirements for having a Roth IRA and so on. I won't get into all those specifics here, but there's something to consider before RMD age, and that is Roth conversions. So right now, we are at historically low tax rates, right? The current tax law is actually set to sunset the end of next year. So depending on who wins in the election and Congress control, we're anticipating seeing higher taxes in the future here. So a Roth conversion basically would allow you to take funds from your traditional IRA and transfer them over to a Roth IRA. Now, that transaction is taxable. You are moving funds from a tax-deferred account to a tax-free account. So any conversion amount is going to be taxable income. But this may be a time before you're required to take those RMDs to see if this strategy would be beneficial to you. What it would allow you to do is pick a certain amount of funds you want to convert to stay within a lower tax bracket without bumping up into the next one and losing more of those converted funds to taxes. So you'll see the next circle there, the red one, and I think this is really important. When you complete a Roth conversion, again, it is going to incur a tax liability. Now, you want to make sure that if you were to do this, you would have outside funds that you can use to pay the taxes on that conversion. You don't want to have to use the Roth IRA funds to pay the taxes, because you want this money in that tax-free account to grow for the rest of your life, completely tax-free. So just keep that in mind here. Consider those conversions, look and analyze them if they're appropriate for you in low income years or if there's a down market year. It could be a very viable strategy for you. Now, again, that if you were to convert those funds to a Roth IRA, the blue circle there, it can reduce the amount of future RMDs, right? You're going to have less in that tax deferred account there because you had transferred funds to a Roth IRA. That could possibly then lower your average tax rate if you're subject to lower required minimum distributions. And I do want to highlight here, Roth IRAs are not subject to required minimum distributions. I also want to highlight Congress recently passed a bill that changed Roth 401ks. A while ago, those accounts were subject to RMDs. They weren't taxable, but you were required to take distributions. That is no longer the case under the Secure Act 2.0 that Congress recently passed. So before we move on here, there's one other item I want to address on possibly reducing this RMD income, this taxable income for you. If you're charitably inclined, there's a provision in the tax code called a qualified charitable distribution. And what that does, it allows you to donate funds directly from your traditional IRA to charity. And that distribution to charity can help satisfy a portion of your RMD. Now, you're allowed to make a QCD, a qualified charitable distribution of up to $105,000 for 2024. I believe actually the inflation adjustment numbers just came out today, the proposed ones, and that is looking to increase to about $108,000 in 2025. So it is indexed for inflation, but that allows you to make this donation directly to charity and reduce your taxable income. I want to highlight here too, that works differently than just giving funds directly to a charity, because if you were to give cash directly to a charity, In order to receive a tax benefit, you need to itemize your deductions. And not everybody itemizes deductions anymore. With the recent tax law, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we currently have, only about 10% of taxpayers actually itemize. So many don't even receive benefits for contributing to charity because that standard deduction that you're allowed to take is actually larger than many itemized deductions of individuals. So there's a lot of strategies here to try to mitigate those RMDs and manage your tax rates over time. And with the tax laws constantly changing, it's something that you should just always be aware of and stay on top of and analyze on a yearly basis to see how you can possibly reduce your taxes during retirement. So on to the next slide here. We are going to be talking about planning out your estate. So, estate planning. When was your estate plan last reviewed, right? No one really likes to think about their future demise, but as you near retirement, you're realistically getting closer to the end there, and you need to have a plan in place. Being prepared with a comprehensive estate plan to ensure your family is not plagued with a financial burden after you're gone, that's very important. You want to make sure that your money is dispersed according to your wishes. So how do you go about doing that? Well, that second box there, you're going to see create a will. And I'm sure many of you on this call are very familiar with a last will and testament, right? That is going to detail the desires, the distribution desires of your assets, funeral arrangements, etc. So having a will up to date is very important. Other estate planning items to consider here, we have a power of attorney. Now, there's multiple types of powers of attorney. There's one for financial matters, and there's one for healthcare matters, that healthcare proxy underneath. So these come into play if you ever were to become incapacitated and would need assistance in taking care of those financial matters, paying bills. For healthcare powers of attorney, you want someone there to be able to make medical decisions for you if you were unable to. So having those in place are very important. There's also one other item underneath called a living will. This is going to basically just spell out medical treatments that you would or would not want to be used if you were to be incapacitated. And that healthcare power of attorney would allow an individual to make those decisions and take action at that point in time. So with these documents, it's very important to revisit them every couple of years, right? Life changes, things happen. You might have marriage, a divorce, you might have new children or a change of residency. So making sure that these documents are revisited frequently, up to date, is very important here. So moving on to the red box here, we're going to see establish guardians for dependents. This is another critical item to address here when you're looking at estate planning. You want to make sure that minor children are well cared for and that there's a plan if something were to ever happen to you or your spouse, that you know that your children or dependents are in good hands. That then leads into the bottom left box here, appointing beneficiaries. Now, if you can take anything away from this presentation, I think this is one of the most important because this is something that gets overlooked very frequently, and that is ensuring that your beneficiary designations are up to date. You want to make sure that certain accounts, such as retirement accounts, life insurance plans, some shared assets, those accounts tend to pass on to heirs or beneficiaries through these beneficiary designations. They don't necessarily pass to those individuals by the provisions in the will. So it's important to have these accounts updated so that you can ensure those assets are properly being dispersed to those that you intend for them to be. Now, again, going into the middle box, consider taxes and law changes. This is very important, right? You don't want your estate to be bequeathed to the IRS. Tax laws frequently change, and we are, again, expecting a sunset of the current tax law at the end of next year. So it's really important to stay on top of the latest regulations here. And there's also different types of taxes to consider. You have income taxes. You may have estate taxes. You may have a state inheritance tax. So planning for these various taxes is critical when you're developing your estate plan. Now, I do want to highlight the current estate tax exemption is approximately $13 million or so. So if your assets are well below that, you shouldn't really have anything to be concerned about. However, come the tax law sunset, that exemption amount is basically going to be cut in half. So many more individuals are likely to be subject to an estate tax in the future years. Now, again, that's of course going to depend on what happens with this upcoming election and who controls Congress, but that's just something to keep in mind here. And the final box, the legacy letter. I think this is a great idea to have and add into an estate plan. This can also further detail some funeral arrangements that you would like. Dissemination of sentimental family heirlooms. What I also think is a great idea here is considering a legacy letter or ethical will you may have heard of. And this basically allows you to discuss what you feel is vital in your life based on your experiences and accumulated knowledge, to share those with the ones that you love, right? Whether this be in a written format or audio or visual, it's just a great way to relay that message to those that you love and care about and provide some words of wisdom to them. So as we just talked about estate plan, there's a lot of documents and things to consider here. So as all of these are being drafted and formalized and compiled, it's important to make sure that they are valid, right? So you can create a will online, but there may be some stipulations depending on your state of residency where that may be required to be notarized. You may need to have a certain amount of witnesses as you're signing these documents. Every state is different, so it's important to be aware of what your state requirements are for these documents. Now, that's great. You compile everything. It's very important to make sure that these are stored safely, right? You don't want to be leaving your estate documents and all this confidential information out on your kitchen counter for years and years. You want to make sure this all is saved in a very secure space. And you want to make sure that individuals are aware of where to find it, right? You want someone to be knowledgeable of where to locate these documents. So some other considerations here, as we just talked about, the powers of attorney and so on. Healthcare power of attorney. When you have that finalized, consider giving a copy to your physician so they have one on record. When you're providing and completing your wills, make sure that your financial planner or advisor, attorney, they all have a copy. So if something were to happen, they can act quickly and they know what the latest version is and they have that on file without having to look for it in the individual's home, right? Trusted friends, family members, the executor of your estate. Make sure that they're aware of where to find these documents. They don't need to know all of the details per se, but they should at least be familiar that they are named as an executor and where to find these documents. So if something were to happen, everything can run smoothly during the whole process here. So another consideration, many individuals acquire many different accounts, different information, and it can be very difficult to track all of this. So consider creating an inventory, listing out social security numbers, dates of birth, bank account numbers, insurance policy numbers, digital passwords, anything you can think of, kind of as a nice summary checklist. They'll just provide great guidance to those who will need it. And again, I just add this down below. Review your plan every 5 years or whenever you experience a significant life-changing event. Things happen all the time. It's important to stay on top of these documents and ensure that your wishes are actually met when you are no longer here. So that again leads into preparing to be flexible. So there's a quote from a famous movie here, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and it's life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it, right? Life moves very fast. It's crazy to think that it's been almost 5 years since COVID happened. A lot has changed since then. There's been a lot of tax regulation. Families have increased, families have changed. So you need to be mindful and flexible during this whole process. So what you set up originally when you think you're going to retire may not actually be applicable or appropriate a few years down the road. So make sure that you're tracking consumption versus your planned spending amounts accordingly. Stay up to date with current tax laws and regulations in case something drastic were to change that would require a change in your plan. So be proactive, working with your advisor, keeping them informed of updates in your life. This will help keep all of your plans on track, prevent unexpected changes from derailing your overall plan here. And I just want to talk about some other key considerations here. Some other things that get brought up frequently as individuals are nearing retirement. One of them is Social Security, right? So consider delaying Social Security if the circumstances allow. So you're able to collect Social Security, assuming you have worked enough throughout your life. You can begin collecting at age 62, and you can delay it all the way up until age 70. So the longer you delay, the greater the benefit you're going to receive. Now, as of 2022, the current life expectancy per the CDC of males is only 74.8 years. For females, it's 80.2 years. So you really need to look at your own family history, your financial situation to determine what is going to be most beneficial for you when going to collect Social Security benefits there. The green box here, don't get too conservative too quickly. That's also important, right? Maintaining a well-diversified portfolio with enough equity to deliver future growth can be key to sustaining a desired consumption later in life. So just because you're retired doesn't mean that you need to completely get out of the stock market and go all into cash or bonds. This is something that you're going to want to revisit and maybe then make gradual shifts over time throughout retirement here. And finally, are you willing to look for any kind of supplemental income, such as a part-time gig, that would make a material impact on long-term sustainability of desired lifestyle? It's okay if the answer is no, but just be prepared to make changes to other goals then to ensure that the long-term health of your plan lives on. And finally here, know what you are retiring to. So we just talked a whole lot about financial aspects of retirement, right? But there's so much more than that. Overall well-being is key to a happy and successful retirement. So consider revisiting and establishing new goals and values for this new chapter of your life. So we listed some things here to just keep in mind. Keeping up with your physical and mental health, along with social interaction, it's immensely important. You don't want to be isolated all throughout retirement here. What will you choose to spend your time on once you've retired? Have you thought through what you are going to be doing? You're no longer going to be working a 9 to 5 and will have a plethora of additional time on your hands. So how do you want to spend that? Who are you going to be interacting with daily? Will that be your spouse, family members, friends? What activities are going to bring you satisfaction and fulfillment? You finally reach the retirement years here. It's time to do what you love to do if you haven't been in the past, right? So if you can answer these questions and align your financial circumstances to complement these goals, that's going to be an exercise worth undertaking here.
Thanks, Joe. I would echo those same sentiments and of course, just share, rarely in conversations that I've had over the years does someone say, my goal is to retire and earn X% in my portfolio or retire and, maintain this amount of money. It's always tied to something so much more tangible, to things that you just, broke down. And, what we see and what we found is that if you have that physical and mental health, it really complements then those financial aspects of retirement. If you're not spending money on, increased medical costs, that helps you spend money, retain assets in your plan to be used for those things that you really want to. So yeah, really appreciate you touching on those. And, obviously, we felt important enough to include along with some of those other more specific financial matters. So that was really all the topics that we had for today. As I mentioned earlier, you will see in the chat box, there's a link to schedule a 15-minute introductory call. We know we couldn't have got to all the questions that were probably sparked throughout the various topics of discussion that you might have. We do have individuals in our firm that are ready to answer those to help address maybe some more of those unique circumstances. So would encourage anyone who's interested, schedule a time, have a conversation, make this as personal as you can to your own circumstances, because that's what's really going to ultimately drive your own personal outcome. I mentioned earlier, we've got some disclosures here we need to put up to read through. It's always important to list those. But really now we'll go on to, Joe, I think, answering some of the questions that have come in along the lines of our discussion today. And I'll take the first one. It has to do with RMDs, something we touched on quite a bit, and particularly gifting those charitable RMDs. You did a great job breaking down, when you can do that and how much that you can gift charitably. But the question is, do I need to tell my tax preparer if I use a portion of my chair or RMD charitably? The answer is yes, you definitely do. Most custodians that you work with, and so you think of the big names out there, Schwab, Fidelity, Vanguard, anytime you take a distribution out of a tax qualified account, something that is typically taxable in nature if you take it personally, if you gift it charitably, the custodians don't want to make a distinction of whether or not that was charitable or not. So they're going to give you a tax form that shows how much was taken out of a typically taxable account. And then it's very important that you tell your tax preparer, hey, I gifted all of my RMD charitably or a portion of it charitably, and let them know how much, because there is a specific way to reflect that on your tax return to make sure that you don't have to pay tax on the amount of money that you gifted charitably. So yeah, very important, something that unfortunately we found does get missed from time to time if that communication isn't there with you and your tax preparer, and in some instances results in having to go back and redo returns to make sure that you pay the proper amount of tax.
Definitely. And I just want to add on one thing there too, Chris. So with these QCDs, you're eligible to make them when you attain age 70 and a half. So that used to be that first RMD age many years ago. Congress hasn't changed it. So if you're 70 and a half, you're eligible to do that. I also want to highlight here that not every state allows QCDs. So you just want to look at what your state tax laws say, because while it may be allowed for the federal tax return, it might not be allowed for your state income tax return. So just keep that in mind as well.
Wow, great point. Great to add that in. Question for you, Joe. Should I name my estate as my IRA beneficiary? You broke down the beneficiary options and making sure that you're up to date on those. Should I name my estate as an IRA beneficiary, though?
That's a great question. So as I've mentioned before, there's been a lot of tax law and new law that's come out over the past couple of years that have modified retirement rules here. One of them is known as the Secure Act. And what that basically did was shorten the duration that beneficiaries have to distribute funds from the account. So before 2020, individuals, beneficiaries of a IRA were able to stretch distributions over their life expectancy, right? So they were able to allow this money to sit in the account and grow tax deferred for decades. Well, Congress came in, and as I said earlier, they decided that retirement accounts are meant to be used for the one who created the retirement account. They're not meant to be used as a legacy vehicle here. So Congress changed the rules here, and most non-spouse beneficiaries now have a 10-year window to distribute the funds from an inherited IRA. If you were to name your estate, you may be subject to only a 5-year payout. So even if your will named a non-spouse beneficiary, say your child, and it went to them, they may be subject to that 5-year payout versus the 10-year payout. And 5 years can make a big difference on tax deferral accounts here. So it is important to consider updating and revisiting your beneficiary designation, especially with the new Secure Act that was just passed a few years ago here, to make sure that your beneficiaries are entitled to the most beneficial distribution strategy available.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'll take the next one. Should I pay off the house before retiring? One that I get often, and the answer, is somewhat dependent, I always say, on, how much is left to be paid off, and more importantly, what rate do you have on your mortgage? We talked about we're in an increasing environment. We have been over the last number of years where we've seen mortgage rates really skyrocket. However, before that, especially during the pandemic years, we had several instances of folks being able to refinance their mortgage at, what are incredibly low, historically low rates, something in the 2 to 3% range. So, is there a blanket answer? Should I pay off the house, or maybe expand that? Should I try to go into retirement debt-free? I think the answer is depending on the interest on the debt, the type of debt that it is, those more predatory interest rates, the credit card debts, even auto loans. Sure, if you can curtail and bring some of that down, it can help reduce that overall consumption goal, help reduce your cash flow. But when it comes to things that maybe I would consider more good debt to have, especially if it's low interest rate mortgage, if your cash flow can comfortably accommodate for whatever your remaining payments are, even if that carries in and through retirement, if your portfolio is historically earning more than what you're paying in interest, it could still behoove you to continue to use the bank's money and pay a nominal rate of interest and let your own money, hopefully over time, earn a greater amount. So you earn a spread on there. So again, it goes back to each person's, each family's unique individual circumstances. It's always great to address that with your own advisor, and kind of consider the cost benefit analysis. But I just want to put out there, it's not a blanket recommendation that, hey, automatically pay your house off. Consider the other circumstances, particularly the rate at which you have your mortgage. Joe, I'll let you take the last question that we have with the time remaining. How best should I plan ahead for the tax law sunset that you mentioned?
It's a great question. I think I mentioned it a few times as well. So just as a reminder, next year is the last year of the current tax law, effective January 1st, 2026. We're expecting a new tax law to be in place. And again, that's going to depend on who wins this election and controls Congress. So how do we plan ahead? Well, as I mentioned, we are at historically low tax rates right now. So possibly look at where we are at. And when I say that this law sunsets, I just want to step back here. What that means is the tax law is going to revert back to the law back in 2017 here. So many years ago, it's been a while. I need to refresh on some of those changes there. But overall, it basically means higher tax rates are coming. So look to accelerate income now while you're in a lower tax year. And look to claim higher deductions or charitable contributions. Look to make those now. Look at Roth conversions, as we discussed, completing those and staying in a lower tax bracket. This is something, though, that I will say it's going to be in the news cycle over the next couple months, if not the next year, on what this tax legislation is going to look like. So it's important, again, to just stay on top of it, understand how these changes are going to impact you, and see what strategies are going to be appropriate for you in advance of this sunset here.
Wonderful. Well, again, Joe, thanks for joining me. Thank you all for staying on through the presentation. Hopefully you got your questions answered, but keep in mind, if we didn't get to your question due to time, we will be following up to answer all the questions that came through via the Q&A after the presentation today. And if you'd like to have a little bit more of an in-depth conversation, go ahead, schedule that 15-minute introductory call. Obviously, no obligation, but we've got a lot of resources here at Savant. We've got a lot of personnel that would be happy to at least help you unpack maybe one or two of those unique questions, just to see if we can get you pointed in the right direction. So please feel free to do that. Check out savantwealth.com. We post a lot about these topics that Joe and I spoke about today. And as I said, we do these webinars, several per month. Stay tuned. There may be a topic in there that is of particular relevance to you. And, we hope we continue to bring that for the rest of this year and into 2025. Have a great day. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
If you enjoyed this webinar, visit savantwealth.com/guides and download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources.